All right, there we go. Sorry about that, Golly, it couldn't have been any bigger. Um, okay. Um, all right, other things that as you all read that you thought, gosh, we ought to think about addressing.
In the spirit of sort of incremental change, that's a lot to be going with for right now. We may want to just sort of wrap our heads around that and then let it marinate, because that's a list.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think you're right, Andrea.
All right, don't make the plate any bigger. It's already full. Got it. All
but
right.
Sherry, I do want to underscore something you said earlier regarding kind of the soft skills and competencies.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, it's those skills that get leadership in trouble, the lack thereof. And so I do think that that's going to be, I don't know if that will be a subtopic or that can be woven into the other areas, right? Because I do think that that's really important.
And Sherry, for a case study, you could use the giant story in the Chronicle today about a highly ineffective president. I just can't believe, like, they took 10 pages on this guy at Collin College. I'm about to write a letter to the editor not to be published to say, why would you do this? What are we to learn from this? It's quite remarkable. It goes on, and I think it's 8 pages.
Gosh, I didn't see that yet today.
Well, this is the print version that just arrived, so it could be last week's. But
Yeah,
I'm trying to think, what's the point here? I mean, they talk about how brusque he is and people are afraid of him and he makes offhanded jokes. And it's like, great. I mean, one page maybe has a little bit of yellow journalism, but this is bright yellow. Deep yellow, mustard yellow or whatever.
Oh gosh.
Chronicle is the National Enquirer of higher ed at this point.
It has become that, hasn't it? Yeah.
Well, and I actually stopped reading it for a while because I was so tired of the yank of the week that it seemed to have become. But interesting. It's like, just fire the guy. Yeah. But apparently I think he's got the support of the board. Yeah. And so this is a way to, influence the board.
I guess.
Public airing.
Yep.
Yeah. Wow.
This Phil, I don't know where this fits, but that reference to the embattled president does remind me that when I've worked with my fellows, I've often tried to remind them of, here are the things you do and here are the things you don't do. And oftentimes presidents get in trouble because they do stupid things. But it's not always self-evident what the stupid things are. And, I can make my short list. Drinking with students would be at the top probably. But, so I don't know whether it's in a skill or an area of expertise, but you can't engage in any of the things listed as critical, like budget management, diversity and inclusion, change management, student success, if you're not in office. And so somewhere, at least in my time with my fellows, I spent a lot of time talking about that.
Yeah, it's funny, Phil. I just came out of another session where we were doing some games and activities, and I don't know why that they're just all kinds of things that we could do with that, of making sure people we talk about those things and we surface the stuff that that folks need to do and not do. So okay, so let's start with the can we start with the sort of what are the best ways to think about the integration of that tool concept with sort of core content areas? What kinds of thoughts do you have about how we might do that?
I don't want to put too much on John's case, but to me, it seems like the case offers a really good opportunity to talk about not just, policy recommendations or, movement recommendations, but how? And what would a leader need to be watching out for? And how might a leader, frame their recommendations and the moves that they're, that the team is highlighting around Bowman and Deal's ideas? What kind of leadership is going to be necessary to achieve the recommendations that the team has for the case issues? And so, embedding those kinds of questions and that kind of discussion into the case, I think it's an ideal opportunity.
So sorry, I'm trying to follow the chat as well. So feel free. And Andrea, are you thinking that it would be a way to introduce that and then model and sort of set the stage for modeling that throughout?
Yes, and if also we're going to be connecting, the case with what Lowell has already presented and may come back and do more with. I'm not sure what the plan is around, the 4 frames. If we're going to connect the case analysis and revisit the case as we talk more about systemic change and change management, then, talking about what soft skills does one need to actually achieve the recommendations. It's one thing to say, we need to invest multi-millions in this area of the institution versus that area of the institution. All right, how do we go about doing that? And it isn't simply assigning new budget numbers. There's a huge amount of change management that needs to go along with that. And so I think the using the case perhaps as a touchstone throughout the whole year and returning to it, and we're having a few different analysis points where we return to the case and say, well, okay, so how would you change what you recommend based on what we've been talking about most recently? Or how would you expand on it? How would you amend? And keep building it. It's actually the Harvard model, right? They use a single case and just keep returning to it. It's not a single instance of analysis and recommendations and our job is done. So, John, what are your thoughts on that?
The case better not suck.
Yeah, true. So, come on.
Yeah, seriously.
I know that Nicholas has his hand up, but I did want to respond to what Andrea just said, because I even think embedded in the case, this is an opportunity. How are decisions made about how do you support DE&I and where do those resources go? So I think that that's a natural place also to embed DE&I into the case.
Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. First a question and then a comment. Is this the Fairweather case, or is this going to be a new case that's being designed?
Oh, I think at least, in the spirit of what we heard earlier, adapting what we have might make the most sense in the current year. I hope we never get to the space where we use the same case for another 30 years.
Sure. No. I just wanted to make sure that that's fine. Thanks. But what I was thinking is looking at, listening to what I've heard so far and looking at the list. One of the things that I try to push is think beyond just strategic planning, but integrated planning for the institution. Mm-hmm. And quite frankly, if you take it, in my opinion, if you take that integrated planning approach, it captures everything on this list, because it's all part of a robust planning portfolio on campus. So it's a matter of thinking about how these things rise and fall. Some of them are contextual, perhaps like the crisis planning you might need to make because an event happened. But then what strategy are you working toward or on to be able to think about decisions you're going to make that'll ripple forward for an institution for 10 to 15 years down the road? So what are you deciding on today to really begin to kind of develop some foresight in your forecasting about what kind of institution you want to be 10 years from now or 15 years from now, and how those strategic decisions are made along the way, and how do you work towards those ends?
So Nick, how would, thinking about how might you want to sort of navigate that with fellows throughout the year? If we had these 4 big topics,
Mhm.
how might you introduce and get them to wrestle with that work?
Sure. And looking at the topics, one of the things, and the point was made as well earlier, is that, what are the intersections of these topics?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of thinking about how they are interconnected, so that you don't think of them as silos of their own, but how are they interconnected, and especially when you think about the kinds of things that are important here regarding, managing and leading change. And then I look at, student success, equity gaps, DEI, and resource management, because, if you wanted to develop initiatives around those areas, how are you going to resource it? And that's people, it's technology, it's infrastructure, and finance. So to begin to point at, I think, the character of these issues, the interconnectedness of them, because a student success conversation and equity gap conversation is going to, intersect with a DEI conversation. What are your institutional strategies around DEI? Then how does it move into that space there with student success? And then when you begin to think about, well, how do we operationalize that? Okay, what resources do we have? What capabilities and competencies do we have as an institution? And where can we start, and where do we need to build? Those kinds of things, so that it gets into an iterative conversation around the strategy in terms of direction for the institution, and then how you realize that is a back and forth coming and going on. Here's what we've done. Here's what we've learned. Here's where we need to invest. Here's where we need to change course. And so for that, I would think, some of the things there at the in addition column, I think the design thinking and strategic planning are important there, and integrated planning more broadly, to help keep these other ideas fresh, and the data analytics and data informed decision making as well, because that has to be folded into your planning processes, so that you're having data informed conversations on your campus that are aligned with mission, so mission driving those activities. So it's for me, typically the place to start is, well, what is our mission? Who are we, and why do we do what we do? Why do we exist? And then see where everything else lines up after you answer the essential identity question, and moving forward in that way.
Yeah, Nick, I really like your idea of an iterative, figuring out how this becomes sort of an iterative conversation. And Andrew, you were sort of referring to the same kinds of things, that we'll get them started on some things, and then if we revisit them, then they have an opportunity to reflect and build on that.
Yeah, I like your, Sylvia, your note that just popped up with respect to equity-minded leadership, and then also linking that to agile administrators. How do those two things stack up? In terms of thinking about a strategic vision about being equity-minded, and then how do you plan for that? How do you develop an administrative set of skills so that you can implement and be effective in those areas? I think it's really really important to to think about how those components connect.
The sages have been rather quiet. Love to hear your thoughts.
So I'm going to say something that it's the dog that's not barking. And it may be that you all hear it and I just don't, but I was struck this morning in the PASHI announcement about the consolidation of institutions. And a lot of people in certain types of institutions are not dealing with how do you get change going and what are we going to do that's great for the future, but how do we protect what we have? And how do you prioritize what's essential and what's existential versus the things that we do that actually are fun, but there's no money for it anymore. And I don't know how you fit that in, because a significant number of our fellows are going to be either at, or they're going to be at their home institution or their host institution, or both, who are struggling with this whole question of not some idea about what could be great for the future per se, new and exciting, et cetera, but how do we even be here a year from now or 10 years from now? And what's that landscape going to look like? And how are we going to be forced to rethink who we're going to be by the very nature of having to go through those experiences? And somehow for me, that's got to be part of the discussion, because it's real, and not everybody is at an R1 or relatively well-off private university or college. In fact, most people are not. And we don't have any community college people this year, but there's an enrollment crisis in many community colleges around the country, which nobody 5 years ago or 3 years ago could have thought could have ever happened. Community colleges were a growth industry, and yet today, not so much. So it's those kinds of questions somehow put into the conversation that might give some challenging moments for the fellows and for us in thinking about the existential nature of our future. Well, you loved that, didn't you?
Yeah.
So
Okay.
Sherry, this is Peggy. This is not a content comment. So I mean, trying to integrate these things sounds lovely. At the same time, if I was in a year-long program, now you have to understand I'm a Gemini and we like variety. If I was in a year-long program and every single session or every retreat, we come back to the same topics, but with an attempt to make it a little different or a little more deeper or whatever, I'm just not sure. So in a sense, we want a year-long curriculum, but does that really mean that the topics, does continuing to repeat the topics turn out to be a good way to engage people, or will they be looking for something new each time? And can you manage both? I'm just not sure that would sustain me over the course of a year.
Well,
so I mean, it's not that you can't
yeah.
integrate, but I assume it means you don't come to all of these topics at all of the retreats, kind of version 2.0.
Well, maybe I'd love to hear from some of the content folks who we've been talking about sort of learner journeys, and that people would be making progress. What are your thoughts about that? Can you think about ways that it would feel substantively different but coming back to the same topic?
I think it's a both and, not an either or. And Peggy, I'm a Gemini as well, so I sympathize, but I do think it's a both and. Not everything we talk about has to be tied back to the case or tied back to one of these 4 big buckets. Those are big buckets, and not everybody who's going to be interacting with the fellows around content are going to be a part of a much bigger conversation, right? Not everybody's here, but I think there are key sessions, key topic areas that need reiteration, iteration, and scaffolding, because they're complex and we can't simply sort of deal with them in one presentation. So my experience as a fellow, after being a scholar of adult and continuing education and higher education, is that it felt very compartmentalized, fragmented, and didn't feel like it had a curricular through line. Not that I was expecting it with every single presentation, but the idea that we wouldn't connect issues of leadership around diversity, equity, and inclusion, one of the most important, most complex, most contentious issues our institutions are going to have to deal with in the next decade, with the other big ideas around what does leadership mean and how do we actually plan for change, doesn't make sense to me. So I think that there's room for both, and I think that thinking through what are the big areas that we need this kind of scaffolded, connected experience for the students, and what are the topics that don't necessarily need to be connected that way, would be helpful.
Well, I know, last year DEI was year long, and I think that worked well, because they kind of moved along. So I don't think it felt like we've done this before or whatever. The notion of all of these things being integrated and trying to manage that over the year just kind of escapes me right now. And just one other comment, as we talk about the frames and insights and whether we're going to do strength finders or whatever, we've talked about how people go through those exercises and then they kind of leave that behind. So we talked about trying to emphasize that as you go into the case, for example, who are you coming to that table as part of a team? What is the team type? What is the team missing, et cetera? And I'd say if some of these things in terms of change management or whatever, as we look at trying to make that real, could be useful to have the fellows reflect on how their type might cause them to take the strategy one way or the other. And is that good or bad? Is that going to lead them to a dead end or the throughway in light of the work that has to be done? So trying to figure out how to put themselves into some of these conversations that are outside of the case, or to understand what other part of a frame do they have to put on that doesn't come naturally in order for them to move ahead with that change management strategy. So just, that's it.
I do also think that, the case is shaped and designed to provoke certain learning, but it also has to somehow give them food for thought for when they are in the real world. Mm-hmm. Could then connect to the placements wherever they are. And you could leave them with a number of questions in this whole process of what do they see when they are at the host institution and even at their home institution. Because if you don't start to make connections between what you're learning in a more theoretical manner with what is happening in the institutions, we tend to think that, what Chuck was saying, that, yeah, this is all very good and nice, but the house is burning and I have to do something about it. And how do you start to think about it? And when is it a crisis? And when is it a planned change?
Val, that's a great question. I struggled with that in doing the case the last time around, trying to keep that a question in the case. But I don't know whether, what Chuck you're talking about is crisis, but it's not crisis, I need to fix something tomorrow. It's like a rolling crisis.
It doesn't have to even be a crisis.
Yeah.
It's how does it manifest in this particular institution? Some
right.
might be crisis, some might not. But like And then when you pull that that knowledge back together, you get information about why do they do it this way? An R1 might do it very differently than a community college, even in dealing with issues of DEI, budget, how budgets are done, and what is the advantages and disadvantages of that?
Mhm.
So Val, I think I hear you saying that some of what would be really useful is as we, is making sure that we're sort of pointing them to
Yes.
the reflections that we want them to, and the analytics and the kinds of things that we want them to do. And it's not that, and I think about, many years we've heard people say, well, the case is that this isn't like my institution at all. Well, it might not be, but the things that have to happen in that case could manifest themselves very differently on different campuses. And that's part of what we want them to do, is not look at that and say, this isn't like me, and so I don't need to bother with it. It is, in what ways, where are these issues manifesting themselves on your
and
campuses?
I think what you're saying is it's really connecting the dots in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you hear presentation, if it doesn't resonate with you at that time, because it's not happening at your institution, it's probably not happening even at the host institution, it was a nice presentation. Now, if someone starts to say, oh, that merely made sense, look what happened over here, that starts to connect things. And in all my years that I've been doing this, that is one thing that I see sometimes missing more than not, is that they don't connect the dots between what they learn in the retreats and what's happening when they go to the fellowship, to the placement of institution, or even home institutions.
I wonder if there might be opportunities there to help them kind of make things that feel case-like, so that they can begin to wrap their arms around some of the different aspects of the problems that you're describing them encountering, Val, because it is true, it's hard to move from anecdote and experience to here's something that I can consider a kind of object of study. I mean, Nick, when you're thinking of working with people on strategy, do you ever turn things into a case like this for them? Is that ever something that one does in a workshop setting, or is that too odd?
No, not at all. In fact, we have a couple of cases that we use to begin to introduce the concepts around integrated planning as a way to help individuals do this kind of work. I was actually writing a note here in the chat based on what Chuck's initial comment about facing an existential issue. And one of the things that I've seen lately with our member institutions are asking for tools and advice on how to re-examine our mission. A lot of schools are coming to this trying to figure out what their core purpose will be now and into the future. And so some may be actually, some of it's provoked by state legislatures if they're state institutions, as the state imagines responding post-pandemic. And some of the private institutions are doing the same thing around really how do we recalibrate our core purpose as an institution? Who are we and who will we become going forward? And we've used it with cases as a mission description or a mission issue in developing an integrated plan. How are you rethinking your mission and core purpose? But one of the other things that we're seeing a lot of now when institutions ask us to help them and we offer our work on integrated planning, we're working with them. They are the case. They really want to figure out what is our future look like. So yes, I guess it's kind of a long way around to answer. Yes, you can do it with cases, especially if there's a mandate that you need to examine your mission or core purpose, either implicitly or it's explicit. You get an external mandate from a powerful body to tell you to do so. And then think about, well, how then do you really address the issues around the existential question. Because one of the things that I wonder about is, are the next 2 years going to be worse for institutions? And if they're not thinking about who they are and why they exist and what do they want to grow into to become, I think we might start seeing a little acceleration around mergers and acquisitions in particular, and maybe even more closures. So this is really, I think, realistic here in terms of what individuals may see in their fellowships. And I like the idea of some way looping this into an experiential learning moment where they can do some campus visits and do some of that landscape scanning to see what's going on and how, in particular, maybe regions of the country. I live in the Great Lakes region, and we're getting, folks there, we're taking a beating. As you know, Andrew, you're up in Michigan, I'm in Ohio, and we were already challenged with thinking about enrollments. This is just in thinking about the accelerator moment we're in now. The pandemic and other forces have accelerated a lot of the things that we may have had a little more luxury of time of dealing with, but the multiple forces on higher ed now and on society now have accelerated the need to adapt and have thoughtful conversations around this. Because it is, and I agree, Chuck, it's the existential question you need to deal with now. And how will you go forward as an institution?
Yeah, if I can just add, it may not be institution-wide as an existential question. It could just be perhaps a department or 7. The elimination of programs, for example, is an existential moment if you're in one of the programs being eliminated, even though the institution needs to do it in order to survive. Those are the kinds of issues that I think putting some of them in are real world issues that our fellows are going to be experiencing or observing or both while they're going through the next year. Some developing leadership skills to enable you to respond sensitively and purposefully, and also with the results you need to get as the leader, it is a huge part of the fellowship opportunity for them, because it's a new way of thinking in so many contexts.
So Chuck, to your point, what I wonder is how do we bring in to the conversation some of the literature that's been produced around these issues? I mean, we've seen, you mentioned PASHE, that's a live thing happening right now.
Right, exactly.
You can also see the number of privates where boards have intervened and rewritten handbooks and other closure moments, and moving away from due process that we've been accustomed to, and in some cases are part of handbooks. And the same thing regarding state legislatures pushing, like in Iowa and Kansas and some other places where you have these are things that we could pull out of the press and other literature to be able to get folks to think about it, because they're going to be in some of those states where these things are happening, and maybe in locations near those schools where these things have happened at those institutions. So it may be worth sort of thinking about this as sort of the live cases out in the world, and really getting them to reflect on, if you were there, or either as a fellow or as an employee, what thought process, what way of managing, and then even thinking about what you can get from what the leaders have been doing in those environments and how they've been, describing that I think could be really powerful.
That would
Nicholas,
be an amazing panel, Nick. I mean, I just put in the chat the new book about Wheelock College, which was acquired by BU, and one of the authors is the vice president for academic affairs. I mean, bring together someone like that. I bet Beth Hillman from Mills would be willing to talk to fellows about what they're going through. People from different sectors and different parts of the country, to just talk about the range of issues that you just invoked that come up as part of this process, and scale it, from institution closes to, Chuck, as you're saying, institution shut down a bunch of problems. Maybe we can get someone from Howard to talk about classics.
Yeah, right, exactly. Another thing is the implication to nearby institutions. In the Pennsylvania case, if I were president of a private institution in Pennsylvania, this would be on the top of my radar screen about an issue, because it's going to have some kind of impact on my institution. I don't know what, maybe, but so it's not just the targeted institution for the discussion. It's also all the other people in the higher education ecosystem in that location, if not beyond as well.
And one of the presidents who's going to lead 3 of the institutions in Pennsylvania is a fairly recent fellow. So hang on to that for real life learning.
And I just want to highlight that I don't think that we need to forget our historical Black colleges and universities in this space that are dealing with not only financial difficulty, but some that have closed as a result of, of just various, scenarios, and their affiliation in some instances. I think of a school, Bishop College, that was affiliated with the Baptist Church. The Baptists, the rich Baptists, allowed a university to close when Baylor is 100 miles down the road and it is thriving. So I think let's make sure that we include those institutions in the conversation as well.
So just as an orthogonal question, okay, why do we have to have one case? Why can't we have a series of cases and reading assignments to prepare for each retreat, and focus the retreat around the bigger issues, but with that as a specific example of particular problems within the bigger issues?
That'd be good for the Gemini. That's a great idea, actually, though, to have different issues that come up and still have to have them dig in. I think that's terrific.
And maybe leaner cases, but more of them, Chuck. Is that?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And trying to the case, rather than having a single case that has to do multiple purposes, and it's hard to make the connection sometimes, do particularized cases that absolutely put the spotlight on the issues of the day for that retreat or that day of the retreat.
That sounds
and
really
just
fun.
with minimum reading, 30 pages maximum, just something to get them thinking.
30 pages, that's a big case. A lot of the Harvard cases are like 6 pages.
Peggy, I'm a historian. That's nothing, I
was going to say the Harvard cases are like 6 to 8 pages.
Yeah, a case you don't want more than a few pages necessarily.
Whatever. Okay.
Sure. Well, a couple of
Chuck has read like 3 books during this meeting. Well,
yes,
right. So, I mean, try and keep up with him.
But I know that in the past fellows I've talked to complained about the reading load. And so
that it wasn't enough?
No, that it was overwhelming. They somehow didn't want to, be scholars of higher ed. And I don't understand that at all. But I think again, there's a happy medium of, shorter case, a couple of key pieces, that aren't huge, but offer insight. And I know that last year's group used the Engage platform more than our group did. How can we use the power of that platform to do some of this processing, that it doesn't have to all be in the retreats. It can and should be, how are we creating opportunities for fellows to process things they're reading with what they're seeing in their placement, with what's happening back at their institution in real time as they go through. And I don't know what the plans are for the platform, but boy, we need to be using that resource.
Yeah, so I think, Andrea, we already, the new version of the platform sort of started with that capability. And so I think the question for us is, how do we facilitate it, and how do we set it up? Because I think we could use that sort of concept in a variety of ways.
Is there a subgroup here that might be willing, as part of their attachment to the fellowship in a curricular sense, be willing to be ongoing conversant, mentor, on the platform, encouraging some asynchronous text-based discussion, but also possibly some synchronous sessions where people have the opportunity to talk and to get together. That is facilitated, but not necessarily, heavily curricular.
Right.
Jerry, certainly last year people didn't use Engage, and maybe they will. What concerns me is it's sitting there, and if it's an ongoing opportunity to weigh in, that's great. But I think it's going to all of a sudden sound as if the expectation is that on a daily basis, weekly basis, or whatever, they're expected to weigh in. And I think that feels like it's not reasonable and fairly unmanageable. So I don't know enough about it to understand its real benefits. And number two, if we're going to do multiple cases, which I actually think is a great idea, I would at least make sure they're not unidimensional. Someone said each one would focus on one of the major topics. So maybe focus, but make sure the other topics have to be there somehow for life to be real. So maybe one's the star of the day, but the other stars are shining just a little less brightly. So, but anyway, the whole notion of weekly or whatever engagement among the fellows, I think you could find maybe some, I think it'd be very uneven. I think some people would weigh in a lot, others wouldn't. It may just give voice to those who have the time and the inclination to connect. And so anyway, it'd be interesting to test it out to see how well it would work without making it feel like it's a daily assignment to have something to come in.
Well, I wasn't even thinking weekly necessarily, Peggy. I'm thinking like every 2 weeks, once a month, something that keeps people connected in between retreat times.
I guess the question is whether it starts to feel like an assignment, or, I mean, they're already out on their placements. They're doing lots of other things. Some of them are working full time, they're on period. It's a question of how to make it feel useful rather than, oh my God, I got to have something to say this afternoon at 4 o'clock so I don't look like the dummy in the group. So I mean, I'm taking the extreme position there, but I just think the notion of it being there all the time, the question is what's a reasonable expectation for participation?
So I had in mind 3, one for each retreat. Nothing so complex as regular stuff going on. So, and it could be that you could craft a case that had different foci, but it was basically the same institution going through a variety of experiences. So
actually, that'd be a good idea. So they don't have to learn.
So it's not a big deal, but when you're experiencing it, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
Because it helps focus on what the primary or what a key element of that retreat is, whether it's D&I or the budget or what have you, in those 4 major topics or themes that seem to be so critical.
One thing that I find very useful, especially when you're dealing with the case, and if you were focusing on a particular issue. So when you're making a decision in an institution, say even to cut programs, let's take that one for example, you have to think about what's the impact of cutting those programs on the rest of the institution. And so it's not about, okay, to cut the program, 1, you do this, 2, you do that. It does, at that point, that's mechanical, but you have to have the broader thinking that when you're taking something away, what happens to the rest and what gets enhanced and what gets, needs to be attended to. So that's really putting all that in context, because it doesn't function. It's not just one thing at a time.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that we've, that I think we have heard is that that we need to find ways to help this group see the interconnections between things. Even if we have to sort of separate them out at some point, they've got to be able to see and begin to process those interconnections. Yeah. Sorry. we were talking earlier about, reading. I think Peggy, and Andrea, you mentioned the complaints about the reading list. And
I've never really heard it. Doesn't sound, I was surprised that they thought it was a lot. So I've got a different take on it.
It may, I don't know how far back that goes. I mean, I know the size of the
We're talking
notebook
folks maybe 7, 8, 9 years ago.
Yeah, I remember the size of
not
things that landed on my desk, and it was it was in print, and it landed with a thud. And so
And I think the
as an
issue,
anchor.
Andrea, is not so much about the reading itself, but because the reading appeared in a vacuum. So it didn't correlate to anything that happened at the meeting. So
Anita, that's a
it
great
felt
point. Yeah.
random.
Yep. So, and what we're talking about is highly connected readings
right.
That are chosen carefully and then used in meaningful ways. I mean, it's yeah. So Nita, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, because I think there was a point at which there was just anything that might, sort of the exhaustive list, and being able to say, here's the first piece you have to, here's the piece you really have to read. If you want to learn more, here are some other things that if you want to dig deeper. So again, creating that sort of journey of, this is something we want everybody to have under their belt, but then if you want to go farther or go down a different path, figuring out what that is. And we've had the really good fortune of our research colleagues have been willing to work with us and help us sort of generate beginning to generate what we've called an annotated bibliography. I know that's really old fashioned, but the notion that in these key areas, here are some things that folks could be reading, and we would make relatively few of those required, but people can choose their paths. Yeah. So I want to come back to I think we're still sort of wrestling with the, how do we help folks see the connections between what happens in the retreats and what's happening on their campuses or in their regions. As we were talking earlier, I was thinking back to, we have historically had an interview assignment that we launched at the beginning of the fellowship year, and the fellow typically went to interview their home institution leaders. I wonder if what we're hearing is that maybe we would think about sort of spreading that out over a period of time, but setting it up so that the fellows are asking questions of the leaders on their home campuses, and that they're not only about their home campus, but they're about the ecosystem and the enterprise. Does that feel like something that then, if we gave them a limited set of those questions and said, go, gather this before you come to the retreat, it gives us things to draw on and have them engage and talk about when they're with us.
Let me comment. I've been listening to the conversation very closely, but Nicholas said something that has stuck with me from the time he said it, and it refers back to "they are the case." That stuck with me. When we talk about how do we integrate it, are we asking how do we integrate it for them? How do they integrate it for themselves? I think we are wrestling with this notion of the case, which admittedly is not organic. It goes back to what Val said. None of us as presidents or chancellors dealt with one thing in segments. It was dealing with a lot of things and asking what guides all of these lot of things in the decisions. And so you may be onto something, Sherry. I think it's how do we get the fellows to see that they are the case, and what are their cluster of skills and competencies that will help them negotiate very simple ideas and very complex ideas, sometimes at the same time. Okay. I'm thinking, I'm trying to deal with a budget issue, and then all of a sudden I get a message that Myers Hall has flooded.
Yeah.
And then before I can settle with that, being in an urban area, someone has just gotten shot down the street, and the news is saying they were shot 2 doors from Johnson C. Smith University. Now, all of these things are happening on any one day.
Mhm.
And it keeps coming back to me as the leader, the CEO. How do I delegate? How do I make decisions that will have to be thought through in terms of consequences, not only today, but 5 days down the road, 6 months down the road? I think that's what we're struggling with in this discussion. We're trying to ask, how do we make this an organic experience for the fellows where they are dipping into their cluster of skills and competencies to solve problems, but it's not sort of, I'm just doing it as a participant observer because really this is not happening at my institution. This really doesn't mean a lot to me. And so then they don't see the application. And later on, they're saying, well, I didn't really learn anything that's helping me do with what I'm supposed to do. So that's what's been going through my mind as I've listened to this conversation. We don't have an organic model yet. It still sounds very mechanical. Let's read this, let's do this, let's have this speaker. We're back where we started.
Yeah, and Ron, I think we've been talking about something similar just because, it's curriculum heavy. And so we look at our agendas from previous retreats, we start with a welcome and then we go right into curriculum. So there's no opportunity for sharing of stories. What happened? What did I learn? What did I do? Who did I meet with? It's just right into curriculum and curriculum and curriculum and curriculum. So, that organic nature of learning, and even for the people who learn in different ways, we're pigeonholing people who learn differently by forcing them to sit in a room with a presentation in front of them, and you may break out for a brief case study and then come back together and report out. So it feels mechanical because it's the same. Each retreat kind of follows a similar format, and I think breaking out of that format is kind of what part of what we're trying to do here, so that it is learning, but it's learning in a way that is substantive for them.
Yep, and always keep in mind is learning for what purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to own that purpose. So I still, Nicholas, maybe want to talk more about it, but I can't get that statement out of my mind. They are the case. When I see myself as the case, I pay attention. I want some answers. I want to understand it. So how do we get the fellows to see that they are in fact the case? And Sherry, maybe they'll be the questions that we want them to answer from their home institutions may help them see that they are the case. If the people at the home institutions will be honest with them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Important one.
Yeah, and I also think, Ron, our some of our earlier conversation about trying to find, we have, as Nita said, we've jumped right into the curriculum, and it's been a one size fits all curriculum, right? So in addition to one of the additional things that happens is somebody comes into a session and they can be in a, gosh, I already know this, so I don't need to learn it, right? Or they could be, oh my God, I know nothing and I'm so far behind I can't even catch up. And so part of how we make them, recognize they are the case is finding different entry points for them, so that some of the learning is more clustered, is more, I'm with a group of people who's as comfortable with this or knows as much about this as I do, and we can use that as part of the journey, because I think that's another way that people have checked out is, I know all this already, or it's not relevant.
Sherry, that last piece, I hope we talk about it again. That sounds really complicated to me, and I'm not one of these presenters, but and how to do that. I mean, there are loads of topics. You could have chief legal counsels in here, but you're not going to break them out probably, because that's not one of the big four topics. But the other is, we're trying to create community here, and so how does that feed into it or take away from it? And I mean, the logistics of it sound just overwhelming to me, unless you have some sense of this that pretty easy and straightforward. But then if they're breaking out into subgroups on a topic, depending on how much they know about it, what are we trying to get them to as a common level of knowledge in order to then have a conversation as a whole group? Because that's ultimately what we're trying to do, right? To bring them together as an entire group to talk about X, whether it's DEI or budget and planning. So it's like, are we talking about little seminars before? And if so, I don't know. It just seems like it's hard to manage. And my concern is that might not bring people together, but kind of create hierarchy in terms of who knows what.
Andrea, Sylvia, do you, what are, as folks who've done this kind of facilitation, how might you answer that?
Sylvia?
Sorry,
no,
I feel like
a lot today, and so I don't want to just jump on in. I think this is where pre-work can help. And it doesn't have to be massively complicated, but those people that self-identify as like, I could use a primer,
okay.
Have a primer available to them. Okay. So, how are we evening some of people's knowledge before we get to a point where we want them to be face-to-face, or if we have to continue to be distant, we have them in some sort of synchronous mode. So, how do you use the power of the Engage platform to make available to folks, here's your primer. Interested? Here are 2 more things that are a little bit more. Really, really interested? Here are 5 more things that over time, you may want to explore. And a couple of associations of people who do this sort of thing that you could tap into, like Scott. And that can be built and pretty static. And then, if part of what we're trying to do is build conversations that that don't have a right answer, where people aren't trying to produce something that they report out on, but they're processing together. I think that also takes away the dynamic of people feeling inadequate or behind in in comparison to some of their colleagues. They can simply appreciate each other's perspectives. So I think how you shape the discussion and what you want people to get out of it helps. And then, what kind of materials can we make available to people who don't feel like they know a lot about a topic, so that they feel more confident coming into that conversation. And to me, especially around issues of equity and inclusion and social justice, this may be a way that we can help foster more engaged conversations. And again, not having a product that people are coming up with. I have in my mind a particular assignment we were all doing together face to face, and I ended up with a group of achievers who are like, well, let's just do this, and then we're fine. We're done, right? Can we go? And I'm like, oh, I thought we were processing. So
you're a bunch of J's.
Yeah. So, how do we, in planning those conversations, help the J's sit back and actually talk?
Well, that's helpful. I think the other possibility to consider is that where you have some experts quote in the group, I mean, we've had CFOs in the group, right, in the past, is when you're dealing with a case or some part of the case that has to do with finance, figure out how the convener leader can engage that person to maybe help with part of the case explanation, or to play some role as well, so that they're actually part of the presentation, so to speak, and we hope not bored, or helping translate for their colleagues the world that they know that's unfamiliar. So I mean, that's the flip of the primer. It's the how do you engage perhaps the person who has something to offer and might appreciate that opportunity, and the presenter might appreciate that help.
Right. And I also think of the way that ACE used to do its president's workshop, where before the convening, they were asked to provide a issue that they were struggling with, or something that they could bring to the group, so that it wasn't so much about us giving you a curriculum, but it was actually the takeaway is giving you some ideas from other people who are peers who are experiencing this, or who may have successfully lived through it. So I think that there's a way to get at some of this, but also give them some practical applications of things, and using the experts within the group. But we plan our days very dense, and so a lot of this that happens organically, like at meal times or at walk times. But I think thinking about that in a way that maybe instead of us bringing the curriculum to them, they bring the curriculum to us, in the sense of challenges, either or learning that we asked them what they wanted to learn over the course of the fellowship year. So there may be, instead of just kind of bringing these up and then never talking about it again, there may be ways to bring these things back into focus for them, so it doesn't feel as random as it can sometimes.
So thank you, Ron. What I'm going to say from my experience and what I think is important, DEI was listed as number 2 of the things that were important, but I can tell you DEI is a topic that many fellows are very uncomfortable with. And so if we think about the case, and I think that's a good way to think about it, I think we have to be, I don't think we can rely on them in terms of developing the curriculum. I think we have to, whether it is a novice, intermediate, or someone who has expertise in the field. And just because you are a scholar who has content expertise, you may not necessarily know how to operationalize it in an institutional context. And so I think that we would be remiss in a leadership development program and not providing them intentional curriculum, but doing it in a manner that might be more palatable. So one thing that I was thinking about, why we have the SAGEs, had we ever thought about having kind of mentors, if you will, that might be former fellows around, and maybe on the Engage platform, or that we could engage to develop questions for them to respond to ask their host institution. I'm going to share something around DEI. I would not necessarily ask my home institution the questions, because I don't believe that in all instances they will get the truth. And I think it might be, if they're dependent upon what level they are at the institution, it might be difficult for them to have that kind of conversation with leadership. So these are just some things to think about, but I think that we have to be intentional about the curriculum, but meet them where they are in their learning and don't give them an out. They are the case, and a part of what they're going to face in leadership are DEI issues across all of the things, Sherry, that you've outlined in these top issues. So there's no way around it. It's just through it.
Yeah, that's great.
And so,
I have hello, everybody. I'm back. My internet crunked and now it's back. But Sylvia, I have a question about how we could make things so that the SAGEs and whoever else is helping can actually bring the DEI work across all the topics. You know, do you have any recommendations for how we could, you know, are there a set of standard questions or leading questions or something?
Well, Tim and I had a conversation in advance of today, and we began kind of unpacking some things around budget, managing diversity, you know, so that we thought that there were things that we could think of. And we've talked about some of those today, you know, so when, and so we could develop questions around these or develop cases, right? There are some issues when we think of budget, that's pay equity for women and for people of color. Our dollars allocated to support DEI initiatives for hiring, both faculty and for staff. When we talk about managing diversity, where is it located? Is it centered with a president, a provost, or, you know, is it the invisible work of faculty and staff of color? And how for faculty is it measured in terms of P&T? I mean, so there's a lot of different ways that we can, crisis management, you know, not only are we looking at social justice and Black Lives Matter, but we're also looking at environmental justice. And so there's just a lot of things that we can look at. Student success, to an earlier point, how are we putting money towards initiatives and programs to support recruitment, retention, progression, and graduation? And what type and where does it fall and who's measuring it? And how are we using that data to ensure that we're mitigating against underrepresented students not being successful? So there's a lot of ways for us to look at it and to develop questions. And we don't have all the answers, but we can certainly help in developing some of those guiding questions or initiatives and activities so that it falls on these big bucket items.
Yeah, I think that would be really, really helpful. And it also would give us lots of opportunities not to let people off the hook.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to be mindful of time. We have about 4 minutes left, and I want to thank you all for hanging in there. I know we had several folks who had to drop off. Nita, is there anything you want to add? Or ask?
Nope.
I would like to know how we get the recording, because mostly I missed this whole fucking thing.
All right. Well, Nita, we can send that out to everybody, right? We can, I mean, I'll, because we promised other folks if they couldn't join us, they could do that. So we can just send it to everybody who was invited, if that makes sense. All right, terrific. All right, well, again, this has been a really rich conversation, and I think really helpful in just starting to think through some of the things that we might do. So Nita and I will sort of, take stock and think about what we want to do and where we want to go next, and try some things out. So again, as I said at the beginning, first of all, thank you for taking the time to be with us and for being such a big part of this process. And if as you go through the next week or two, you have ideas that you think, oh my gosh, I should have said this, or I just thought about X, please send them to us, and we'll put it into the body of work, as we think about it. So. All right. Well, thank you all for spending an hour and a half with us. Really good to see everyone, and we'll stay in touch then.
Sounds
Bye,
great.
everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.
Take care.
How interesting. She just left.